This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
We're talking about centuries worth of oppression of women.
Every single woman in the world has been told that there's something that they need to change about their body.
As young girls, we're not taught how to say no.
Your apathy allows other men to do it. So don't feel guilty, feel responsible.
And many people still don't believe that coercive control is considered domestic violence.
On its current trajectory, it's going to take us 135.6 years to close the gender gap.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 2 of The Shift, we explore the intricate world of women's health and help you discover how to balance your hormones and understand yourself better so that you can truly thrive.
The menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female well-being.
My mum just used to say, "Oh, Nan, I'm so sorry. It's part of being a woman."
I would like to call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. As we come to the end of this series, I've got to say that I've got a lot of emotions moving through me. When I set off to make a series about women's health, I thought I'd be talking about hormones, stress, and the usual suspects. What I didn't see coming was this theme that showed up over and over again, and that is the theme of what it has meant to live and survive as a woman in the last few generations, and how this has impacted us on a physical, emotional, and cultural level. If I want to champion change for women, we need to make it bigger than our health. In this final episode of Season 2 of The Shift, I'm going to deep dive on some very confronting yet important themes. I'm going to talk about the systemic suppression of women, the removal of our power, and the inequalities that we experience as women even in this day and age. This is the hardest but most important episode that I've ever had to produce. And we're going to be covering themes around violence against women, patriarchy, and how this has impacted us as women. Ultimately, this episode is about taking back our power and helping other women to do the same. It's about the larger societal shifts that need to happen to allow women to thrive. This episode has some themes around domestic violence, sexual assault, and other sensitive topics. If this brings up anything for you, be sure to contact Lifeline or your support practitioner. Earlier in the series, we talked about the plight of women being listened to by their physicians when it came to their health issues. There is a long history of women being ignored, gaslighted, and even told that their symptoms are in their head. The impact of this has been devastating for so many women who have questioned themselves and their own sanity, and push down their inner knowing and intuition. This medical gaslighting is just one example of how women are impacted by societal norms. But I believe that this goes so much deeper, and we could really make a whole series about this topic alone. As women, we're not taught to love ourselves. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Our path to self-love and acceptance is fraught with difficulties, as we push against cultural and societal norms and a disparity of how women are treated compared to men. There are deeply embedded norms that promote discrimination and violence towards women. And it begins in the childhood years, where gateway behaviours that lead to this level of discrimination and assault are encouraged and even celebrated. As a mother of a daughter, I was acutely aware of certain disadvantages that she could experience as a woman. My heart broke one day when she came home from school and told me that she wanted to be an air hostess. I said, "That's amazing, sweetheart, but you could also be a pilot if you wanted to." I was met with a firm, "No, mummy, boys are pilots and girls are air hostesses." Now, while you and I know this to be untrue, she's kind of right, and society knows it. We have 5-year-old children already gender stereotyping each other, already restricting what they can and can't achieve based on their gender. We live in a world where we grew up on fairy tales that depicted the helpless damsel in distress that needed to be rescued by her prince. The heroes of our stories were not women, they were men. And while this is changing, we have a long way to go to change these cultural norms that have coloured the way that women have been treated for centuries. This isn't just happening here at home. Every day, in just about every country in the world, women experience inequality and discrimination. Women are still less likely to be in government, less likely to get promotions, and they're paid less. They're more likely to be victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and rape. And if you're not sold on this idea, just look at the numbers. Worldwide, 1 in 3 females will experience violence or abuse in their lifetime. 153 countries still discriminate against women economically, with 18 countries having laws that prevent their wives from working. There are 781 million illiterate adults in the world, and 2/3 of these are still women, a figure that has not shifted for over 2 decades. On average, women are paid around 24% less for comparable work, and women make up only 24% of parliamentarians worldwide, and only 5% of mayors. I want to begin with Dr. Kulreet Chowdhury. Dr. Chowdhury is a neurologist and Ayurvedic doctor that has a wide breadth of experience. She became a doctor in the US and was later asked to come to India to study the Siddha, ancient medical texts that are over 3,000 years old. And she is the first Western-trained physician who has been able to examine them. Because Dr. Chowdhury has lived in both the East and the West, I wanted to know what she thought about the state of women's health in the world right now.
It's absolutely awful, but why would it not be awful? Because if you look traditionally, whenever invaders or outside influences or leaders of a country, whenever they wanted to completely annihilate the sanctity of any culture, the first thing they did was annihilate the sanctity of the women, and that involves, of course, their healthcare and their healthcare systems. It's said in the Eastern traditions that when the woman in the household is strong, the energy, the Shakti that flows through her heals the whole family, heals the whole community. And so the role of the woman in society is just so important. And so if you look around and you see the state of human society, you would understand then how women are being treated in the state of women's health. It's a direct reflection. So it's awful, but it's not surprising because they are the ones that are kind of the gatekeepers, so to speak, of the flow of love, spirituality, knowledge, and, Shakti, which is feminine power. And it's that feminine power that feeds societies, that feeds communities.
As we've moved through this series, I've spoken a lot about just how amazing it is when a woman is embodied and in her full power. We've spoken about some of the psychological and emotional aspects that keep us disempowered, but I wanted to revisit this part around not feeling good enough. Here is Kate Reardon, naturopath and founder of Natural Instinct Wellbeing.
The common thing that comes up, and it's so true in the story of my life, is this feeling that we're not good enough. And I think that wound is really strong in the feminine psyche. I don't believe it's immune to men. I know men feel the same as well, but I know women really feel this. And it manifests in so many different ways throughout our life that sometimes it's even hard to understand, that's that core wound of I'm not good enough. I mean, we know it in our physical body. I don't want to look this way. I want to be thinner. I want less cellulite. I want less pigmentation. I don't want grey hair. Like, we know that feeling of not being good enough in our physical body. I feel like most women can identify with that in some way, shape or form, purely by the external images that have been put into our brains from a very young age. But it's that mental and emotional feeling of not being good enough that is sometimes harder to even understand. So, for example, A couple of months ago, I was going through Instagram. I'm a mum of very young children. And so some of the people I follow on Instagram are like mums, right? And they're doing craft stuff with their kids and they've got these beautiful playrooms and everything's pastel and orderly and gorgeous. And my house is the complete opposite of that. I like to call it creative chaos, but it doesn't look like that. It's not clean. There's like all the colours aren't lined up perfectly. And I know Instagram's not real life, but I was just totally mum shaming myself in my head, sitting on the couch at home, having this dialogue with myself. And then I'm going down this whole spiral of like, oh, and their kids, like, look how neatly their shoes are lined up and they've got beautiful clothes and my kids are still wearing yesterday's pajamas, you know, just like totally mum shaming myself and thinking this is my wound of not being good enough. It didn't matter what image I was looking at. It could have been a girl at a beach in a bikini. It could have been this beautiful lady's house. It could have been, I don't know, a green juice that I didn't have that day. But whatever image I was looking at, that wound was looking for evidence to prove what I was feeling is that I'm not good enough. So it can show up in so many different ways. And unless you have a concept of how thoughts and beliefs behave, then it's really, really hard to catch that sneaky little bugger out sometimes.
Personally, I've worked incredibly hard to get over my not good enough complex. And even still, I see it creeping up on me from time to time. We can fall into the trap of shame and comparison and question ourselves constantly. We spoke about women having to aim for unrealistic ideals of perfection in the last episode. But I want to now take a look at some of the ways in which our society is embedded to treat women differently to men. Fiona Gale has been working on the front line with women in domestic violence for over 15 years. She has worked with some of the highest risk cases in Australia, helping those women to navigate the system and working alongside police and domestic violence support services. Being high risk means that the woman is at risk of death at the hands of her partner. We're going to dive into this shortly, but to begin with, I asked Fiona what her experience was growing up as a woman.
So women from even my generation were taught, you know, that if you made your bed, you had to lie in it. For instance, like 30, 40 years ago, it was much more of a struggle for women to get divorced and be able to look after their kids and be able to afford to have a half-decent lifestyle to actually survive well. I was taught that once you got married, that's your bed, that's what you made, that's what you have to deal with, and there's no room for divorce. I was the first person to get a divorce in my family, for example. And I remember watching the news as a young teenage girl and there would be a rape on the news and my dad would say things like, what was she wearing? She was probably asking for it. Men wouldn't rape women that didn't deserve it. So, you know, that whole patriarchal space of growing up. I remember even, you know, Dad talking about sex as, for me as a teenager was like, oh, well, it's a woman's job to keep a man satisfied and women can't say no to men. Once you're married, it's, you know, your job to keep him happy. You know, don't feed your meat man at home. He'll get his meat elsewhere. You know, that whole patriarchal space. So it wasn't until I probably came into my 30s. And so for me, I then joined the army at 17. And then, you know, I grew up in an environment where kids were seen and not heard. And so then you felt rather powerless and you actually didn't have a voice as a teenager. Then you join the military at 17 and it's probably another really big patriarchal institution where you're getting screamed and yelled at and basic training. And I remember I can even go back and watch Women in Lines. It was called a documentary that the ABC done back in the day. And actually, it's hard not to like look at it and be horrified of the patriarchy that you hear in it. Like women had to go to special classes to behave like ladies, but they weren't sending the men to special classes to behave like men.
Fiona touched on patriarchy. We're going to talk more about this as well as words like misogyny and feminism as we move through the series because it's important for these terms to be defined. Nikki Mee is the founder of an organisation called Free to Shine and the author of Do What Matters. Free to Shine was established to help fight sex trafficking of children in Cambodia, and you'll hear more about this later in the episode. Nikki is an absolute trailblazer when it comes to the fight for equality, and her work helps so many girls and women. I asked her to describe what gender equity actually means.
Gender equity is the equal treatment of all genders. It means genders will enjoy the same rights, opportunities, responsibilities, and protections. So if we look at what that would look like in a gender equal world, we would see equal access to education for girls and boys. We would see equal representation of women in leadership positions in workplaces and politics. There would be the recognition of the value of unpaid and domestic work. We would see equal access to economic resources. We would see no discrimination against women and girls, and there'd be no gendered violence. And gender parity is a statistical measure that's used to describe the ratios between men and women and boys and girls in a given population. So it's the measure we use to say how far we are. And globally, we're 68% of the way to equity. And going at the speed that we're going at on its current trajectory, it's going to take us 135.6 years to close the gender gap worldwide.
Okay, wait up. I want to repeat that. At the current trajectory, it's going to take 135.6 years to close the gender gap. 135 years. Surely we can do better than that. So how does gender parity show up? Here's what Nikki has to say.
I think it shows up in all sorts of ways, doesn't it? Like, so if we take here in Australia, for example, my most recent example is my friend has just taken up bodybuilding. And so I went to support her in her first competition. It was about 4 weeks ago. Not only were the men in bare feet while the women had to do everything they had to do in 5-inch heels, but the women, this is what really fascinated me. The women were instructed by the judges to smile 12 times in a 4-hour period. And I counted the number of times that the men were instructed to smile, only once. And I got another friend who was looking to rent a house in Brisbane, and she found a house that she liked. She was about to take it, and then he wouldn't rent it to her. And she got the real estate to find out why. And it was because he wanted his lawn mowed, and so he thought he needed it rented to a man so that he'd get his lawn mowed. So, you know, it's showing up all the time, but I think it comes down to representation of females in leadership positions. It comes down to the gender pay gap. And then you see it in violence against women. We also rank 50th for the percentage of women in Parliament. Only 27% of the National Cabinet are women.
I used the example earlier about my daughter and how even little kids assume gender roles and play these out. There are so many examples of how we see this disparity playing out in our lives as women. It's in the way that we need to push harder to get into leadership positions. It's in the way that we need to protect ourselves from assault on the way home from a bar. It's in the way that we have to politely and tactfully fend off men that might be interested in us or ignore wolf whistles from cars. These kinds of issues are pretty isolated to women, and there are a lot of layers to this story that we're going to continue to dig into. One of the things that women disproportionately suffer from is physical and sexual violence. 1 in 3 women worldwide will have experienced physical or sexual violence in her lifetime. This can include rape and other sexual assault, domestic violence, and other acts of violence. As a childhood survivor of domestic violence, I'm part of this statistic. My father was an alcoholic who had a temper when drunk, and my mother, my sisters, and myself bore the brunt of this. As well as the daily verbal abuse and fear, I can recall many incidents of my father going off the handle, beating up my mother, myself, or my sister, and police being called. Mum would leave, we'd have a period of reprieve, and then Dad would be back in our lives to repeat the cycle again. I later found out that my mother had tried to move to Tasmania with us to get away, and she had to return to Melbourne because my father had threatened that he would kill her if she did not. Most women experiencing domestic violence will leave and go back 6 to 9 times before they are permanently out of the situation. This was certainly my mother's experience, and I've seen this cycle play out many times in my clients. From an outsider that hasn't experienced this type of trauma, it can be easy to wonder why on earth that woman would put herself in that situation. Because domestic violence is so incredibly common, I want to crack open this topic and really critically break down what is happening here. Here we have Fiona Gale again, talking about coercive control. If this term is new to you, it is a non-physical form of abuse that occurs in a relationship over time. Let's explore this a little.
Many people still don't believe that coercive control is considered domestic violence. So that coercive control is levels of control without physical violence. So a lot of people still attach that physical violence aspect to domestic and family violence, but it's so much broader than that. I believe that once we look at that confusion, like for instance, I was speaking to a dear friend recently, and when they started to watch that new Netflix series Made, she was like, oh my God, I didn't even realise that I had experienced domestic violence previously. But she said, I've just started to watch Made, and because it's about the coercive control, she said, that's exactly what I experienced in my marriage. He would punch the wall next to my head or say, I'm not physically hurting you, so it doesn't count. But that level of fear that she had in those years of not wanting to upset him because of that level of control and abuse, and that she wasn't allowed to sit down during the day, when he walked home and said, oh, well, the house is not immaculate. What have you done all day? When looking after children is a full-time job on its own. So all those sort of things and how they have years of impacts. And it's not till you look at what is coercive control and what does it look like around the control, the threats, the standover tactics, minimising what's going on. So really it's your fault that this is happening. You bring this on yourself because your own behaviour. So women start to second guess who they are by that point. And so it's that over time of that pattern of being worn down and feeling more powerless. I think when we look at coercive control, it's a lot of the time outside of that physical violence. It's about making threats, to carry out threats to do something to hurt you. Threatening to leave you, threatening to commit suicide is a big one. I probably on average heard that from up to 10 women a week, where there'd be threats of suicide if you don't do this, or you can't go out or I'll kill myself, or if you, go back to work, I'll do this. So those threats of committing suicide was a big one. Reporting her to welfare, that she's not looking after the children well. So that continual coercion and threats that happen, the intimidation, so looks and actions and gestures. Like I've been in situations where I can read someone's body language and I think, oh, she's in trouble when she gets home because she's done something wrong at a party, and he's looked at her, and you can pick up on those looks, actions and gestures. Things like smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets can be another big one that we hear quite a bit about. So that intimidation, the emotional abuse, so putting her down, making her think she's crazy, not taking her concerns seriously, playing a lot of mind games can happen. And that's probably just a third of what coercive control is. There's so much to it, like the isolating behaviours, seeing what she reads, where she goes, who she's speaking to, limiting her outside involvement, the minimising and denying and blaming of it. So then she thinks that that's normal, that happens for everyone. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what's happening because it's outside of that physical violence.
As Fiona mentioned, coercive control often happens so slowly that many women are not aware of what is happening until it is brought to their attention. It might begin by your partner asking for you to check in when you arrive or leave somewhere, often masked as concern for your safety, or telling you that your friends aren't good for you and isolating you so that you don't have a support network. It could be control of finances, which disempowers you when you need to leave, gaslighting, playing mind games, or restricting your movements. Women in these situations are slowly chipped away at until their self-esteem, self-worth and power are taken away. These behaviours are important to recognise and call out, as they can lead to more dire consequences down the track, including significant physical violence and even death. Fiona has seen this many times in her work, and she explains here.
Rarely do you have a death where there's not a build-up to physical violence, but there is situations that has happened where there's been no history or reports of physical violence. He hasn't ever physically hurt her, and then it gets to a point where she, for instance, leaves him. So the highest risk factors is when a woman leaves a relationship that has coercive control, and women are most likely to get killed in that period of time. And so that's when it just accelerates from 0 to 100, and in that space of time is our highest risk factor. So that's when she potentially can get killed. And also not just her, but there's a lot of time you can have murder-suicides and children also get killed in that space.
In Australia, 1 woman a week dies at the hands of her partner. In the US, more than 1 in 7 women have been severely injured by an intimate partner, and 1 in 10 have been raped by an intimate partner. 6 women are killed by men every hour worldwide, with the majority of these deaths happening in their own home. Statistically, a woman is safer walking home from a nightclub alone through a park at 2 a.m. than she is in her own home. Here's an off-the-cuff statement that I hear all the time. So why doesn't she just leave? It really highlights the lack of understanding of the complexity that goes on in a domestic violence situation, and I asked Fiona what she thought of this.
It's not till you've experienced what domestic and family violence and coercive control can actually do and how powerless we can start to feel, and we can start second-guessing ourselves. It's not just easy leaving, especially if you add having children to the mix. Like, I've worked with women who have 4 kids under 5. And as, we talked about Maid earlier, that depicts it beautifully, I guess, in the form that women will consider leaving, but then you've got to, pack the house up. You're going to leave your rental. You're going to go into a women's refuge. A lot of women don't even know women's refuge exists. So then you nearly feel like you could be going into a whole environment where you're locked in with other women and you can't get out. So that amount of pressure to leave when there's so many unknowns to even make that decision. So everyone says, why doesn't she just leave? And I want to be able to say to the system, how about we start talking about why the violence is happening and why doesn't he stop being abusive and controlling and committing domestic and family violence and terrorising the family?
Michael J has some very powerful perspectives on domestic and family violence, and I wanted to hear what he had to say. Michael was a refugee that came to Australia as a boy and went on to become a professional cricket player. These days, he's on a mission to change the culture that leads to the suppression and violence of women. The terms domestic violence and family violence are interesting, and I wanted to share Michael's point of view on them.
Well, I'm going to go controversial here, Catherine. The reason I think those terms are a misnomer is that it's possibly the only serious crime that we name by the venue it takes place. The home, family, domestic. Well, the house doesn't jump up and hit you in the face. It is somebody in the house, and statistics will tell you that more often than not, it's a male perpetrator. So let's call it for what it is. We don't call shark attacks river attacks or ocean attacks. We name it by who did it. So let's start being honest about this. Let's not talk about violence against women. Let's talk about violence perpetrated by men, or in the odd occasion, perpetrated by a woman. Let's call it for who it is.
Violence against women happens on a spectrum. From the mild to severe, there are many ways in which women have felt unsafe, been abused or traumatised. This could range from a guy at a party that won't take no for an answer, someone having sex with you without your consent when you're drunk or passed out, being constantly harassed with sexual innuendos at work, having a partner be unfaithful or having a second relationship that you don't know about, or physical or emotional abuse in the home. We then have acts of violent rape and sexual assault. But perhaps some of the most harrowing stories come from the young girls that have experienced atrocities that we could never even imagine. As I share this next part with you, please be warned that some of the content is very confronting, but I believe that this information needs to be shared. If we are to make a shift, we first have to really see what is happening so we can take action where we can.
So sex trafficking is the recruitment and or movement of someone within or across borders. It's through the abuse of power, position, with the intention of sexual exploitation, commercial or otherwise. So when a child is trafficked, say in Cambodia, for example, sometimes it happens that a trafficker will literally target which families they're most likely to be able to succeed in doing this with. So they will target the most at-risk girls. And that is very, very often girls who are out of school and living in immense poverty. And often they will offer a job because that girl is not in school. So the family needing money are more likely to allow that child to go with them for what turns out to be completely fake job. but they don't know that at the time. They'll say things to them like, we've got a job in the city and it's with a very nice family and she'll be looking after the children, which growing up in these rural villages, that's what they're doing at home anyway, just not getting paid for it. So the idea that then they could help bring in an income by doing that for another family, and of course that job doesn't exist. They don't actually go and help a family elsewhere. They actually get tortured because when I first started learning about trafficking, I was thinking it was about the multiple rapes of these children every day, but it's actually about the torture that they have to inflict upon that child or young woman to begin with, to break their will, to be able to constantly rape them. And when they had been through that and survived it, which only approximately a third ever survive, a third are murdered while they're in there and a third commit suicide in there. So only about a third ever get out. If they can go through that, I don't think I could endure for a day what these girls went through, sometimes for months and months. It made me determined from the platform that I arrived from, the privilege that I can arrive from, to act upon what they'd asked me to do, to help make sure it didn't happen to somebody else. So I guess I took that anger and devastation and sadness and all those other things and just focused it into action to actually be useful to them.
As I mentioned earlier, Nikki Mee is the founder of Free to Shine. Free to Shine provides access to education, food and shelter so that girls do not get targeted by sex traffickers. I asked Nikki what inspired her to work in this area, and she told me the story of Sinna.
She was trafficked when she was 13. She was actually the first survivor that I met when I actually arrived in Cambodia for that first month of working with survivors. She was the one that opened the door and shook my hand. Really good, strong handshake. She was so happy that her work was now to help other survivors. And hence I can tell you her story because she's happy to share that and sort of have that awareness raised. But she was 13 when she was trafficked. She was kidnapped, drugged and raped. And she was kept in a nice hotel, in a large cupboard in a nice hotel, and bought out when men paid to have sex with her. And one day a customer complained that she didn't smile enough. And so as a punishment, she was taken and locked. She was stripped naked and locked in a coffin for 2 days. And she said that the only thing that stopped the ants from crawling into her eyes were her tears. But after that, she smiled each time a customer raped her. There are an estimated 4.8 million victims of forced sexual exploitation, and 99.4% of those are women and girls.
Wow. And how old are we talking? How old are these kids that are getting trafficked into this industry?
That varies. So the 21.3% can literally be really small children, like babies upwards. I've known children as young as 5 and 6. I met a girl who was 4 when she was trafficked, and she was kept in a cage and brought out when men wanted to have sex, paid to have sex with her. A lot of the time it happens around the teenage years, 12, 13, 14, 15.
I couldn't believe my ears when I heard this statistic. There are an estimated 4.8 million victims of sexual exploitation. Clearly, this is not isolated to a few bad people. These are children that are taken from their homes and subjected to a horrific life. It's hard for the average person to get their head around this, and the instinct is to look away, put your head in the sand and wipe these thoughts from your mind. But this is a systemic problem that is impacting millions of women worldwide. And without shining a light on this dark subject, we can't make a shift. And this is exactly what this podcast is about. So my next question was, what on earth has caused these massive amounts of violence against women to occur? What needed to happen in order for someone to lose their humanity so much that they could treat another human being this way?
I think two things immediately spring to mind when I think about what causes massive amounts of violence against women and sex trafficking to happen, but then the broader picture of the foundations upon which that's built. So I think if you start to look at what is it that enables these men to do this, I'm not sure we're ever going to understand what drives that kind of depravity. But what has to happen is they have to be able to disconnect. So they have to be able to disconnect from their own soul, but they have to be able to disconnect from the woman or child that they're hurting as well, to see them as less than, which is why, for me, I think a conversation around equity is so important around this, because I think that's the lack of equity is the foundation upon which all of this sits.
Let's now take a look at what history shows us. Were women always treated this way? Let's take a deeper look into the rise of patriarchy and misogyny and the consequences of this for women.
It feels like since the very dawn of time, individuals within their own gender are pitted against each other.
Patriarchy says that men should be in charge and women should follow along and do what men want to do.
So they end up earning less, they're less ambitious, and I think this is sort of God's way, this is nature's way of saying women should be at home with the kids, they're happier there.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man, I will not.
It is a culture of lack of impunity, of accepting of violence and violent language against women.
The problem is that firstly, at the moment, they're not reported. They're not recorded because women are given the message from every level of society that they shouldn't come forward, that it isn't really a crime, that they won't be taken seriously, that it's just normal.
The attack, a form of revenge by an angry young man, one who was hell-bent on blaming women for his own personal loneliness.
Patriarchy is a system of relationships, beliefs and values that are embedded in social, political and economic systems that structure gender inequality in the favour of men. Misogyny is a hatred or contempt for women or girls.
Misogyny can also take much smaller forms, embedding itself in everyday conversations and eroding a girl's feelings of self-confidence and self-love from a young age.
It is a form of sexism that is used to keep women at a lower social status than men. These terms were not always necessary, but in today's culture, they're absolutely pivotal.
Our culture devalues femininity. Things that are deemed feminine are often looked down upon.
The fact is that women and men have held different power dynamics on and off throughout history. In many ancient cultures, women were revered and celebrated. They were seen as the ones that could give life, to birth and raise children, and were revered for this huge contribution to society. In many ancient cultures, women were not only seen as equals to men, but in many cases the superior sex. Women were priestesses, warriors, and political leaders. There were matriarchal societies where women were the leaders and chiefs. The first poem that we know of that was ever written down was written by a woman called Enheduanna. She was a priestess in a Sumerian civilization, and the poem is a prayer of praise to a female deity called Inanna. The first known author was therefore a woman, which is very interesting considering that in later times women were discouraged from writing and learning to read. Another example is that in the Celtic culture of Gaul, which we now know as France, and in the British Isles, women fought alongside men as warriors. They may not have been as physically strong, but it was recorded that they made up for this in their fierceness. A British Celtic queen called Boudicca fought against Roman invaders and was a political and military leader. In the early Christian church, there is evidence that women held positions of power equal to men. There are indications that Mary Magdalene was a significant religious leader on par with Peter and the other apostles. This would change, and later Mary Magdalene would be portrayed as a prostitute and a sinner, despite there being no evidence of this in the New Testament Gospels. In the 4th and 5th centuries AD, there was a systemic degrading of women in the writings of church fathers, where we saw St. Jerome and St. Augustine proclaim that women were weak and hysterical and open to temptation, and even that women's hair should be covered because it was the work of the devil. These same church fathers blamed Eve for the downfall of humanity, and by extension, all women everywhere. These writings had a huge impact, and even today women cannot be priests in the Catholic Church. We also saw this shift in medicine. Women had traditionally been healers and custodians of the knowledge about herbal medicine and other folk medicine techniques. Their wisdom was highly valued, and they were an integral part of villages and communities worldwide. As time went on throughout the Middle Ages, men began to take over roles that had traditionally been dominated by women. Apothecaries, surgeons, alchemists and doctors began to compete with herbal remedies. Doctors began to dismiss these traditional medicines as quackery and changed the narrative to make their own treatments superior, which at the time included bloodletting and leeches. Eventually, it became illegal to practice medicine of any kind without going to university, and universities did not admit women. This culminated in the witch hunts and witch trials of the 1600s, which led to thousands of women being burnt at the stake for practicing herbalism or anything related to traditional ritual, ceremony and medicine. The Witchcraft Act, which was in force between 1563 and 1736, accounts for the death of over 3,000 women in Scotland alone. It saw thousands of women being interrogated, tortured, and usually burnt to their death for their so-called crimes. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 100,000 women perished because of these laws. You could argue that the witch hunts were in fact a war against women, aimed to disempower them and increase the power of the church and the men in charge against women. Around the same time, male doctors began to accuse women of having hysteria, a word which comes from the Latin word for womb, by the way, and lunacy, a word which has links to the moon and was related to the changes they would experience during the menstrual cycle. Early diagrams of conception showed women to be empty vessels designed to hold the male seed, and it wasn't until the 1900s that science actually recognised that women held 50% of the DNA of their children. Women have had a long stretch of history where their role was to solely raise children, be a good wife and a homemaker. In many societies, marriages were arranged, and we still see this in some cultures today. The truth is that things have really only begun to shift for women in the last few generations. Women could not vote until the early 1900s in most countries. It has been through the work of revolutionaries that have fought for women's equality that leaps and bounds have been made, but we still have a long way to go. The 20th century saw two wars which forced women into male-dominated roles, and it showed the world that they too could contribute outside of the household. After World War II, many women did not wish to go back to their lives, and a media campaign was struck to emphasise the traditional female role and the value of keeping your man happy and putting his needs above your own.
Here's to the ladies, the fair and the weak.
Every woman needs to be herself at times. Your answer? Baking.
The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time.
The homemaker walks miles every day, from sink to icebox, from cupboard to stove, and from kitchen to dining table.
In the 60s and 70s, we saw the beginning of the feminist revolution and the fight for freedom and equality for women.
Liberation! When do we want it? Now!
Well, the main demand, of course, is equal rights. Equal rights to have a job, to have respect, to not be viewed as a piece of meat. We just want what men have had all these years.
Since then, the normalisation of women in roles put aside for men has been steadily increasing. And you might think on the surface that equality has now been reached. Women in the UK, US and Australia still get paid an average 14 to 16% less than their male counterparts. Worldwide, we still have epidemic proportions of domestic violence and sexual assault against women. And while these issues can also happen to men, which is also not okay, it's a drop in the ocean in comparison to the levels we see in women.
We owe future generations a world free of sexual violence. I believe we can build that world. Do you?
I think we are heading in a right direction, because when I started this work 15 years ago, barely did we get media coverage on domestic and family violence. It wasn't talked about like it is now. So I believe that a lot more is changing. We are talking about it, and that how it's a whole of society issue, you know. Even 15, 20 years ago, people still talked about it being behind closed doors and no one's business, and domestic and family violence is everyone's business. I think it gets back to what you're talking about, and the roots in patriarchal male dominance for centres in society have given more power to men than women, and that there's been permission to dominate and control women. I don't know if you've heard the saying, rule of thumb. You couldn't hit your missus with anything bigger than the thickness of your thumb. Yeah. And so when people talk about rule of thumb, it actually, when you have a look at it, was linked to even police saying, oh, you can't hit it with anything bigger than your thumb. So when I hear the term rule of thumb, I get a bit cringy because I'm like, it's actually a terrible saying. And it's about those long-term patterns of tactics that get used, and it's that build-up of those tactics and the shifting of the tactics. So no longer this tactic works, then it'll shift to another tactic and a different tactic. I remember, probably in my 30s, I organised, even with a lot of my friends, to go out on a dinner. And it was a Friday night. We were just going out for dinner. We all had children. We were all mothers. And I remember there was 10 of us that were going. And by the time we actually got to the night, there was 3 of us. And so half the women said they weren't allowed out. So then there was 5 of us. And then out of the 5 of us, 2 then rang up and said, he's not going to look after the kids. So I've got no one to look after the kids, and I've left it too late. So now I can't come out because I've got no one to look after the kids. So, and then we had the 3 of us at this dinner. And I remember one of my friends who then got 50 messages on her phone coming through every 5 minutes saying, how long are you going to be? Which then made her really anxious at the dinner. But I just remember thinking this night that should have just been a really easy night, a group of young mums getting out to have dinner. This same partner ended up coming to pick us up and took us home. And I thought I was going to die on the way home because he was driving so erratically, because he was so angry that she wasn't responding to him quick enough and that she'd gone out. That the time I got home, I just remember thinking, I'm not going to organise another night out for a while. So, that male power that in that situation, that it gets to a point where a lot of those women wouldn't have seen that was going to be something that happened for them before they went out. So I remember even up to that point, some of my friends' partners said to my partner, I think you need to get her under control because she's impacting on our relationships and getting our wives to do things that we don't want them to do. And then, of course, I'm the voice of yeah, but you've got rights. We get to go out. This is what we get to do. And it was interesting how then other people seen my partner as, she obviously wears the pants in the relationship because you can't get her under control.
That was Fiona Gale again. Have you seen these types of behaviours in your friends? I know that I certainly have. I can recall a friend whose husband used to look after their child and call it babysitting, and acted as if he was doing her a favour. I can recall remarks that my friends made about their partners that seemed harmless at the time, but on reflection, they really weren't okay. Let's now take a look at misogyny a little more closely. Here is Nikki Me again.
I read something by Farida D, who was an Arab gender researcher and poet, and she said, you don't become a feminist, you're born a feminist. No one was born believing that women deserve less rights than others. The patriarchy teaches us that. Everyone is born a feminist, and you either remain a feminist or you become a misogynist. So misogyny is really described and defined as hatred or contempt for women and girls. And it exists, but again, I don't think it's the main problem. So like with sex trafficking, you've got those who are willing to rape and torture. They exist, but I don't think they're the main problem. If the rest of us in society stood up and stopped it, we'd be able to conquer these issues because they're in a minority. So I don't think that we have a lack of gender equity because of a few misogynists, a few people who literally hate or have a contempt for women and girls. I was speaking to a friend of mine, and he was actually saying that when men speak up about gender equity, they very often get challenged on what their motives are, and they get called things to try to stop them, to try to shut them up, put them back in the box and stop discussing it. So that, they'll get called snowflake, puff, social justice warrior, whatever. They'll keep getting called things until they shut up. So his take on it was that, yeah, we have toxic masculinity. We know that we have that, and we know that that's a problem. But he doesn't think that's the biggest problem. He says fragile masculinity might be a far greater threat to equality. It means we've got to have that courage to to have the conversations, to listen to the facts and the stats, learn the facts and stats. And then when you see something that isn't equitable, confront it, not accept it. But we have this culture where we all look on and let it happen. We don't confront it. It doesn't come out of nowhere. That person who gets to that point in their life where they're attacking a woman in that way, there will have been thousands of small opportunities that people have let go. I think one of the best things we can do to help people is to have transparent conversations so that they know there's always a place they can go and talk to people and they'll be heard. You'll hold that space for them. Which begins with teaching the small boy children and the small girl children and not having most of the male characters doing all the talking and making the decisions and things. It's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. You have to start really, really young. We have to stop doing those things.
I realized that this problem was not a woman's problem. It was not a problem that can be solved by women. It was not a problem that began with women. And the realization that some of the problems that we're facing at the moment, it is solely and wholly within the remit of men to fix. There's a whole lot of reasons why men don't want to do it, why they won't do it, and why there's resistance. But until we talk about the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room, sadly, is men. Not all men, not all men by a long shot, but the elephant in the room is men. And until we're prepared to say it and call it and be courageous enough to talk about it, we're not going to fix this issue. All the statistics and the numbers around disrespect begins with one perpetrator. So much of the conversation around violence against women is the wrong conversation because, again, the prefacing there is against women. And we should be actually forgetting the women concept. We should be rephrasing that sentence, reframing it to say who's doing it. And it is men that are doing it. And it's not just domestic violence, it's the intersectionality of all things throughout mankind's history that has been evil have been perpetrated by men. Again, not all men. We're talking about colonialism, we're talking about slavery, we're talking about racism, we're talking about homophobia. Throughout history, the power and control that men have traditionally had since Adam and Eve were knocking about in the Garden of Eden has been because men have controlled the agenda and they have got a vested interest in ensuring that they never relinquish that power.
Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power. They dominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. And yes, I'm certain it's the foundation of the issues that we see. I don't know how it's happened. I'm not an academic or a historian. I don't know how it was that we've set it up this way, but I can really only talk more for how it continues. And I think that comes down to this. What I see around me so much is a level of apathy where it's like, well, it's better than it used to be. We've come a long way. Let it be enough. Just be done. You've got the vote. You can go to work. You can run a company. It's done. Leave it. Like, okay, it might not be equal, but, it's all right. It's good enough. And this apathy for us to not address it and not demand for it to be different, not hold it to a higher standard. We shouldn't be allowing it to take 135.6 more years.
You just heard from Michael J. and Nikki Me again. For these crimes against women to happen, there needs to be a certain level of contempt. I asked Michael J. why men in power have historically treated women this way.
It suits men to treat women with contempt because it suits men to hold power. It suits politicians even today. It suits our politicians around the country to hold the reins of power because in holding the reins of power, they control the dynamic. They're probably deeply, deeply insecure men, some of these people. And to be fair, Katherine, some of the women that inherit these roles of power, I've seen happen, they almost become those men that they despise. In order to swim in that swimming pool, they almost have to swim like the men. And I've seen that happen so often where women ascend to power because they're bringing something new to the table. And you go, hallelujah, great, a female voice and a female perspective. But so soon, in order to survive in that shark pool, they take on the same qualities, the very qualities that they despised, they become those people. So There's a sadness that men do it. There's a pragmatism why men do it, because it suits them. Why do politicians and sports stars and the Donald Trumps of the world think like that? Because it suits them, and people vote for them. People keep them in power, but the people who keep them in power are also the people that benefit from it. So where's the investment? If you're being purely pragmatic as a business person, where's the upside to changing something that's working for you? If it's working for you, you'd have to be self-sacrificing to walk away from something that makes you richer.
What needs to shift in order for women to have better lives and for gender equity to be reached? I asked Nikki Mee what she thought.
Apathy needs to shift. We've got to stop accepting. We've got to stop looking the other way. We've got to replace apathy with courage. Courage to look, courage to ask, courage to have the conversations, courage to listen to the conversations, courage to learn the information, learn the stats, learn the stories. And then you really have to dig deep and take the action so that when you see an injustice, whether it's gender equity, whether it's one of the things that come from that, like harassment and violence, the courage to call people out on it in a safe way. You have to learn enough to know how to do that safely, but to call it out and not let it go, not look the other way.
Let's bring this conversation back to women's health. How has patriarchy and the themes we've been discussing impacted on our physical and emotional landscape as women? Dr. Andrea Huddleston is a chiropractor and women's health expert. I asked her what she thought.
I think that it ties into this rise of, I guess, the patriarchy. And this is, we're talking about centuries worth of oppression of women. And if you look back into the history of, I guess, the myths around menstruation, particularly when we moved away from pagan rituals and religion to more sort of Christianity, that is when there was a really big shift and fear that started to develop around women's bodies. And this is when women who are menstruating started to be seen as unclean and almost as those heathens. And then rituals around sort of segregation and seclusion of women who were menstruating started. There were things like we couldn't touch food, we couldn't prepare food, we couldn't be around certain people when we were menstruating because it wasn't understood. And I think that because we had the potential to be literally the givers of life, I think that there was a huge element of fear there. So if there's that suppression of that feminine by that patriarchy, I guess, and by those religious sects at the time, then that's sort of how they kept so much control. And those themes are pervasive throughout most religions worldwide. And then we get to, the 1950s when things could have changed, but instead we brought in oral contraceptives. And so I think that this was a really important shift in like a woman's biological revolution. So all of a sudden now we have pharmaceutical drugs that actually suppress, again, those normal physiological functions of our system. And yes, it was made under this idea that we can control our fertility and our ability to conceive, but now it has sort of been this ongoing thing where we're just suppressing those normal physiological functions and suppressing hormones and taking our own hormones offline with this element of control.
Every single woman in the world has been told that there's something that they need to change about their body. There's something that's not right. The beauty standards are so unachievable for everyone that we are expected to look a certain way and feel a certain way and be a certain size. And I know that we're embracing a lot more variety and diversity in that in 2021, but still it's undoing like decades worth of marketing that is aimed at changing us and fixing us. It's decades worth of us not feeling like we're on par with others, or that we deserve to have everything that we want, or we deserve to feel sexy. It's really like a Madonna whore complex. Like, be sexy, but not too sexy. Be feminine, but be aggressive. You know, if you're standing up for your rights and you're an aggressive female, like, it's all encompassing, and it just leaves, you know, women in a really precarious place where they're not sure what they should be or who they should be, because they want to be all encompassing, but they're being told that they're not allowed to be. I think the trajectory that we're on is a really good place. And, you know, the week that we're recording this is a very difficult week in Australia, because we've had a lot of women's rights rallies going on because of our political climate and because of sexual assault cases in Parliament and across the world. You know, I think that it's a really hard and emotional place to be right now as a woman. I think that we need to band together and we need to accept diversity, you know, when it comes to race, when it comes to ability, when it comes to the way that we express ourselves. And I think that if we continue to move along this path of embracing diversity and embracing the fact that we should all be ourselves, and abolishing body shaming and fat phobia and racism and ableism, then I think that we will be in a much better place, hopefully sooner rather than later.
You just heard from psychosexologist Chantel Otten. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I didn't realise that this podcast would end up exploring these themes. But now that I've gone there, I can see that it was staring me right in the face. The next question is, what can we do about it? There is so much work to do, so let's explore some of the ways in which things need to shift.
The only way we're going to fix this is if men realise we're going to need to talk about men. The elephant in the room. Let's put the elephant in the room out here. It is about men. Is it all men? Of course it isn't. If you as a man or as a woman protecting a man in your life, if you have to live by the excuse that it's not all men, you are being ridiculous. Stop it. Because if it isn't all men, don't be upset. If it's not you, if you look in the mirror and you realise that it's not you, why are you being defensive? Because there are enough men that are doing it. The global's numbers, 1 in 3 women in their lives are physically or sexually assaulted. It's not 1 in 3 men that are doing it, but it's certainly not 1 in a million, right? It's high enough to be a problem. So stop with I hear this excuse all the time, it's not all men. Of course it's not all men. And if you are not one of those men, jump on board and be part of the vanguard of change, because the longer you defend and excuse and hide behind not all men, you are part of the problem. Your silence is part of the consent problem, and your apathy allows other men to do it. So don't feel guilty, feel responsible. Guilt never fixed anything, Katherine. It never filled anything. But responsible people who changed the world changed outcomes. So let's separate guilt from responsibility and say to men and those women and those mums who protect their sons, etc., say to them, if it's not your son or not your husband, don't feel guilty. Get angry and change the world. There's a famous quote by a feminist author, Lily Tomlin, which says, I always thought that somebody would do something about that. And then I realized that I was a somebody, words to that effect. And it's that notion when I realized that throughout my younger years as a professional cricketer, for example, I spent so much time around those nightclubs and those airports and those hotels and those social scenarios. I saw behaviors that were appalling. I was a quiet, timid, sensitive person who was always told as a refugee to Australia, I was told, keep your mouth shut, know your place, speak when you're spoken to. And that silenced me. When I saw stuff that was happening, I looked down at my shoes. I looked awkwardly around the room. I wished somebody else would have the courage to speak out. So whilst I would truthfully say I didn't directly perpetrate those behaviors, I will also truthfully say that I have contributed to a culture that has enabled permission for those behaviors to continue. And if silence isn't a form of consent, then I don't know what is. You don't often have to actually swing the hammer or swing the axe to cause the damage. I allowed people to behave like that because I was lacking in courage to speak out. And it's a source of guilt, but it's also a source of enormous determination to make sure that, if you miss the bus, doesn't mean you'll never catch another bus ever again. You are allowed to miss a bus. You're allowed to miss a few buses, but it shouldn't put you off trying to catch public transport again. So I'm determined to catch a few late buses to this destination of a world where equality is just assumed because all humans are equal.
Strong words by Michael J., but it makes so much sense. As a society, we have perpetrators, but we also have enablers. Our young men need to be taught to have the courage to speak up. A lot of this has to do with toxic masculinity and what society has deemed that it is to be a man. It's also the way that men have been depicted as the leaders, heroes and saviours in everything that we're exposed to. I mentioned at the start the traditional storybooks, where there's always the damsel in distress and the man who comes to save her. Men are depicted as strong and women are depicted as weak. What we're exposed to as children has a huge bearing on who we become. The feminist movement is something that has been helping to shift this, but what exactly does that mean? Nikki Mee explains.
Feminism is the belief that women and men should have equal rights and opportunities. So I think everyone should be a feminist. So I think everyone, men and women, need to be challenging these issues when they see them. I don't think it will happen with one group and not the other group doing it. And yes, I do think that women don't challenge it, women accept it. I also think that women have been taught not to challenge and accept it, just like I actually think men have been taught not to as well. But it doesn't happen that we live in a gender equal world till we're 18 and then when we become adults, it changes. Like, we're teaching our very small boy children and our very small girl children how to live in a patriarchal society. So if you look at representation on the screen, just in children's TV and children's movies, there's not equality, there's not equal representation in what little children are watching on the screen. So even among the top grossing G-rated family films, male characters make up 60.9% of the leads, whereas female characters are only 39.1% of the leads. Girl characters are outnumbered by boy characters. This is in family films, 3-1. That is the same ratio that has existed since the end of World War II.
As I worked through the content for this series, I wanted to know, how can we empower our young girls, our daughters in this time? How can we help them to become resilient, aware, and loving their own bodies?
Taking a step back first, if I can talk more about our role as parents, and I think this is where some of us have, and I know I feel the same, I put myself in this category, I didn't open the conversation early enough. And as soon as I was aware of that, I did. But I wish someone had have been able to say to me, hey, you don't have to pretend to your children that these things don't happen. You can have these organic conversations from the minute they start to ask you about their body, from the minute that they say, hey, Mum, where did I come from? Instead of saying, ask your father, or, oh, the doctor put you in there, or the stork delivered you. We can have the conversation then and there because the child is actually ready when they're asking. It can be age appropriate, of course. It doesn't have to be this graphic detail, but just enough to keep the facts because kids love that. And it's interesting, we have an emotional attachment to especially our sexual experiences. They don't have that. So we can feel a bit embarrassed by talking about it, depending on, which area of your reproductive health you're talking about. We can feel a bit awkward about that. But if you just deliver children the facts, they're generally pretty satisfied with that. And if they ask another question, they're ready to learn more. And so I think being able to have that awareness from a really early age, so it is this beautiful, organic conversation that continues throughout their childhood and teen years. So nothing actually becomes taboo, weird, or not spoken of. And I can guarantee you too, we can feel a bit funny about that as parents, but the first time you do that and you open up that conversation honestly, it'll be far less difficult than you think, and then it gets to grow from there. I know we're not as confident as, each other. I think the other side of this is that we weren't taught properly as adults. So how are we supposed to pass this information on if we don't understand ourselves properly? So there's two parts to that. I think we've got a responsibility as adults and as parents to start to talk about this from a very young age to prevent it being this big issue or this big thing that happens when all of a sudden a girl starts menstruating. And if it's not nice for a 9-year-old to get their period, of course, but if they had that from a young age, none of that would happen. But having said that, if it is happening and there has been no conversation, I guess very quickly it's about having plenty of open and honest conversations, asking and answering a lot of questions, and again, age appropriate. So you can still do that at no matter what age that you realise that, actually we need to start talking about this, and to not make it taboo, to not make it weird, to just make it a part of life and a fact. And it really is about conversations. There's not much else there is that you can do, I don't think, to help through that process and growth and maturation, I guess, at that point in time. So it is tricky, but I think that the solution is going to take some time to change the way we do this. I think schools are doing a much better job of this now, just watching Olivia go through it. However, it depends on who it's taught by, and kids are still scared of getting their period because, of course, it's unknown. I think the taboo and the scariness needs to be removed, and hopefully we can switch it more to being about being curious and excited for the day that happens, rather than something that's horrible and gross and potentially problemsome.
That was Doctor of Chinese Medicine and author Nat Kringoudis. Nat has a book called Beautiful You, which is specifically written for teenagers to navigate early womanhood. I asked Chantel Odden what she wants to say to the young women of today.
That you're worth it. You're worth focusing all that attention on you. And I'm not talking from an egotistical kind of way. I'm not talking about material goods. I'm not talking about a sense of hierarchy or elitism. I'm talking about the fact that you're beautiful and that you're wonderful and that you're allowed to be whoever you want to be, as long as you are kind and empathetic and treat others well. I guess that's the most important thing. Ditch the scales. I think that would be a really positive thing. Go off the way that you feel, the way that your clothes fit, the way that your skin looks, focus on taking time off. I'm very lucky as well in my clinic to be able to organize my own schedule, and I work that around my menstrual cycle and my energies, and I allow all of my staff to manage their own schedules too. And I know that that's a very privileged place to be, but that is a way for me to live a more wholesome life and for me to have a better sense of self and wellness. And I really feel like everyone should be able to negotiate that within their workspaces and within their friendship groups, to be able to not feel pressure to have to perform all the time, but to actually allow themselves to take care.
I think you have to be, not just in the medical setting, everywhere as a woman, you have to be very mindful of what you allow into your life, your thinking, your belief system. You have to curate really carefully what images you look at. I remember at a certain point when I was losing weight, organically from balancing my hormones, I was struggling with a bit of body dysmorphia just because I had been so overweight. It was still hard for me to see myself properly. So I just realized, I don't know exactly how I realized this, but I just said, okay, I'm just not going to look at images of women. I'm not going to buy fashion magazines. I'm not going to do that to myself for a while. And I'm telling you, within a few months, I was just able to really look at myself in such a positive way and really see myself the way that I actually looked. And so that began a little game that I would just have been playing over the years of like, well, what do I want to let into my world? What ideas, what images, what belief systems, what works to empower me and increase my sovereignty and autonomy and make me feel like I have agency? And what are the things that make me feel negative, self-critical, or like a victim? Those are the things I want to actively keep out. And I want to be very selective and curate just the best influences for myself. I think the messaging that young girls get, really from the beginning, that their bodies are there to be an ongoing project, to decorate, to work on, to improve, that's a very different inculcation than what little boys receive, from the beginning. They really pick up from the ether, from the culture, that their bodies are tools to help them master their lives. And it's the point of pride. It's something you take seriously. You take care of yourself and you use it to be your best self and express the full potential of yourself.
I love this advice from author of In the Flow, Alyssa Vitti. If it wasn't for these unrealistic images we were fed as children, we wouldn't think that our normal bodies were so wrong.
There is no bigger change to a woman's system than, obviously like birthing a baby and the entire, obviously physical, mental, emotional, everything change that comes with that. And previously, women would have had support and a community or a tribe to help them raise that baby. But now we very much exist in almost like silos where we really are lacking that connection with our community and for a lot of us, our families as well, because we're so spread out now that so many of us don't have any other support. So it's no wonder that is just so, so hard. And I know that women are really missing that, and we can see that as part of their hormonal function as well. So studies have been done that show that women who have those close, meaningful relationships with their girlfriends, and when they spend time with their girlfriends, it actually increases their progesterone production. So this is part of how we de-stress. So women don't necessarily do that traditional sort of fight or flight stress response like what men do. We actually respond to stress, a bit differently. And women do this thing called tend and befriend. So we are biologically determined to need those close, meaningful friendships and community and connection. That's part of our safety and our stability, but also our de-stressing sort of mechanisms.
That was Dr. Andrea Huddleston again. This lack of the village contributes to so much stress and overwhelm that we experience as women. Here's what sex and relationship expert Kim Anami has to say.
I think that's a huge first step, is really educating yourself about what's possible so that you can reframe the ideas and beliefs that you may have absorbed over the decades. And then it's about removing blockages, is looking at things that might be acting as the running shoes, right? Things that are suppressing that natural expression of your sexuality. And so an example of that would be, say, the beliefs that your family, that your mother and father had around sexuality, how their sexual relationship was, and how that imprinted itself upon you. It's also in the culture at large. For women, the Madonna whore block is a really big one, right? Like we grow up with this idea that women are either sluts or they're virgins, and there's really not this happy middle ground of being a voraciously healthy sexual woman, right? There's judgment. And so there's that to work through. And, the stats are extremely high for people who've suffered some kind of sexual abuse or trauma. And if that isn't properly healed, that will then have an effect sexually and physically on a person for the rest of their lives. And so these are three biggies that people have to really examine and then shift and heal.
What stops us from stepping up and stepping out? Dr. Amy Shah is an integrative medical doctor and the author of I'm So Effing Tired. I asked her what she had to say.
Somebody equated it to crabs in a bucket. So if you put crabs in a bucket, there will be some crabs that try to climb out of the bucket, but the rest of the crabs will pull that crab back. And they say that, that's similar to some of the negative feedback or the resistance that you will get when you start to change your life in a healthful way, that sometimes it's hard for some of the people around you. And to me, that really was very visible to me. There were people in my life who supported my growth and wanted to support my growth. And there were people in my life that didn't like it. They either didn't like that I was doing something new and different because it was threatening them in some way, or maybe it was, they felt like, why not them? Whatever it may be. But you can quickly see, and this goes in relationships too, right? They say that the best partner
for you is one that supports you, but also lets you grow. Like they are there for you, but they also let you grow on your own. So you're still with them, but you're also growing. And then there's other partners that people find as they start to grow, that other person wants to pull them back.
How amazing would it be if we could go back to this idea where like women's hormones and the ebb and flow of her cycle was really revered and honoured, like you were mentioning in the instances of, you know, the red tents and when tribes would do things like moon bathing where the women would ovulate and menstruate with the full and new moon together. And that was just, you know, a biochemical pheromonal thing that would happen. And they would remove themselves from their men while they were menstruating to, you know, nurture each other, to look after each other. The men would see that as a very, you know, they would have such reverence for that because it was seen as such a deeply spiritual sort of event where the women could take that time out to replenish themselves and often just reflect and then come back to, you know, the tribe with important messages and information that they need because that's part of our power. I just think that that's so amazing. It'd be nice if we could withdraw from society for, you know, 5 days a month all together.
This is Dr. Andrea Huddleston again. I'd like to end this episode with one last part from her.
Your system is not, as I keep saying, is not designed to malfunction. You are not designed for suffering. So it's absolutely worth paying attention to this stuff. And I have this saying that like your health has a greater purpose. And I wholeheartedly believe that if we can just kind of get out of our own way and if we have a healthy functioning system, for example, if we have balanced hormones or if we have periods that are pain-free or whatever it might be, it allows us to just get on with whatever it was that we feel like we were put on this planet to do and get on with whatever our true purpose is. And that should be what health is all about, just allowing us to just get on with our own sense of purpose. I really think that women will change the world when that is the case.
Thank you for listening to this very important final episode of Season 2 of The Shift. While some of these themes are confronting, awareness is the first step to making meaningful change, and we need to be aware of the scope of these issues. There are so many interweaving themes in this podcast. We discussed synergism and the amazing interconnectedness of your body in episode 2. And this conversation adds another layer of understanding to the landscape of health. If you've loved this series, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or the platform of your choice. Please share this with your friends and family. And if you post on social media, then please be sure to tag us at The Shift Clinic and Katherine Maslen so that we can say hello. Thank you so much for supporting this series and the work that we do at Shift. Our mission is to change the face of health, and this podcast is how we're able to reach the most people across the globe. Everything we do here at Shift is about helping you to live a better life, and your reviews and feedback about the show absolutely warm my heart. I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift.
Coming up on The Shift.
This is the final episode of the main series, but don't worry, there will be more. Watch out for the expert series, the best parts of each individual expert that will be released very soon. Make sure you subscribe and follow us on social media so you don't miss a thing.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice
and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The Global Goals.
A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
The Global Goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the Global Goals.
This project supports Global Goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most. When we're trying to make a shift in our lives, all it can take is one small thing to set us in the right direction. Perhaps for someone you know, it could be listening to this podcast. My hope is to get this into as many ears as possible. So if you know somebody that's stuck and needs to make a shift, why not send them this podcast? It could be the one thing that sets them in the right direction.